The cold February morning that changed the course of a 66-year-old mystery began without ceremony, the way most turning points in long-dormant cases do. Detective Richard Morgan arrived at his desk shortly after 9 o'clock, the fluorescent lights of the Pennsylvania State Police headquarters flickering in an uneven rhythm that had irritated him for years. He hung his coat on the back of his chair, sat down, and woke up his outdated desktop computer, expecting nothing more taxing than routine follow-ups on cases that had refused to yield for decades. But at precisely 9:30, the notification appeared in the corner of his screen, a soft chime that barely rose above the hum of office conversation. It was not dramatic, yet Morgan felt something in his chest tighten, a quiet instinct sharpened from more than 23 years of working cold cases. The kind of instinct that whispers before logic catches up. A new CODIS alert. A potential DNA match. He clicked the message, and a case number materialized, one he had never seen before, but felt inexplicably as if he should have. The name beside it made him lean backward in his chair, blinking once, slowly, as though his vision might be playing tricks on him. Patterson, Helen Marie. Missing since early October of 1958. File last updated in 2021. Morgan stared at the screen, almost certain that he must be misreading it. Cases from the 50s rarely appeared in DNA databases at all, let alone with a confirmed match. The science simply had not existed then. For a moment, the weight of 66 years pressed against him, a sensation he could feel in his bones. What sort of evidence had survived more than half a century? He clicked deeper into the alert, and there it was, an impossible truth rendered in digital certainty. A DNA match to an individual named William Francis Garrett, a man who had died in 2020. His genetic profile had entered the system posthumously only when Pennsylvania expanded its DNA collection policies to include archived samples from individuals arrested before routine swabs were standard. Garrett's had come from a saliva sample taken during an arrest in Allegheny County almost a decade earlier. The match was tied directly to biological evidence, collected from a 13-year-old girl's torn yellow dress found in rural Ashford County in the fall of 1958. A dress belonging to a girl who left school one Friday afternoon and never came home. Morgan opened the Patterson case file, waiting as the sepia-toned photographs loaded with excruciating slowness. The grainy school portrait of a bright-faced 8th grader finally appeared, her Peter Pan collar neatly pressed, her expression earnest in the way children looked in photographs from that era. She had been an honor student, a devoted older sister, the daughter of a coal miner and a homemaker, a child who walked the same route home from school every weekday, for 2 years without incident, until the day she didn't. The moment he began reading the original file, the documentary of her disappearance replayed itself in his mind. It was early October in a small western Pennsylvania town where porch lights flickered on as dusk settled, where the mine whistles set the rhythm of daily life, and where neighbors still left their doors unlocked and waved to one another with casual familiarity. Helen Patterson had woken up cheerful that morning, excited for an upcoming school dance, and proud of the book report she had just finished. She wore the yellow floral dress her mother had sewn for her 13th birthday, smoothing its skirt before stepping out into the crisp autumn air. Her walk to Ashford County Junior High School was so ingrained in routine that no one ever expected danger to lurk along it. Cedar Lane to Maple Street east for 4 blocks, then north on Highland Road. She strolled past the Kowalski family's corner store, past the old Garrett property with its unkempt hedges, past familiar driveways and front porches. People had seen her that morning, smiling, skipping slightly, adjusting the strap of her school bag. Nothing seemed unusual, nothing at all. And yet, by that afternoon, the world had shifted irrevocably for the Patterson family. Catherine Patterson, Helen's mother, stood at the kitchen sink, peeling potatoes as the hours crept past. Helen was punctual, always home by 3:45. When 4 o'clock passed, Catherine moved from window to doorway, from doorway to porch, each time convincing herself that Helen was just delayed. But by 4:30, with no sign of her daughter, she began walking the route herself, stopping at the Kowalski store to ask whether anyone had seen her. The answer was no. Then came the discovery that froze the entire town. At roughly 5:15, Daniel Kowalski noticed Helen's books scattered near the intersection of Maple Street and Highland Road. They were not placed neatly, they were dropped, as if torn from her grasp. Her English literature anthology lay open to the wind. Her lunchbox had not been touched. The neighborhood shifted in an instant from calm to dread. Chief Harold Brennan mobilized every resource he could. Police officers, volunteer firefighters, coal miners just off their shifts, families from nearby streets all scouring woods, fields, and roadside ditches. Voices calling her name echoed into the darkening October evening. The search grew as the night grew colder. State police arrived, followed by bloodhounds, followed by the FBI the next day. More than 400 volunteers joined the effort at its peak, combing terrain that locals knew intimately, from creek beds to abandoned mine shafts. But Helen was nowhere. The investigation stretched into winter, then into the next year, until leads went cold, evidence degraded in ways no one yet understood, and the Patterson family slipped into a lifetime of grief marked by rituals of desperate hope. Catherine filed a new missing person report every single year. She preserved Helen's room as if time had frozen. The grief hollowed her, and eventually hollowed her marriage too. Thomas Patterson died in a mining accident in the mid-1970s, still carrying the silent burden of a father who never learned what happened to his daughter. Decades passed. The case became a ghost story whispered in Ashford. The corner where Helen's books fell was known simply as Helen's Corner, a landmark of sorrow that outlived nearly everyone involved in the original search. What no one knew was that the truth had survived in microscopic fragments sealed inside an evidence bag tucked away in a courthouse basement. Detective Margaret Sullivan was the one who rediscovered the box in 2003, long after the case had been forgotten by most. She found the yellow dress, carefully preserved, torn violently at the right seam. She found fibers that did not match the dress. She found fragments caught on fences or wedged into sidewalk cracks. She found what the investigators of 1958 could not see: biological material clinging to those fibers, nearly invisible, waiting for technology that had not yet been invented. And eventually, when forensic genealogy became powerful enough to read the story hidden in those fibers, the truth emerged. A partial DNA profile, distant family matches, and finally one name: William Francis Garrett. It was a name that meant nothing at first, but as Morgan dug deeper, it became a name that reshaped everything. Garrett had lived directly along Helen's walking route. He had been questioned superficially decades earlier, but never flagged as suspicious. He had a history of violence that slipped through jurisdictional cracks, and he had been right there, hidden in plain sight, the entire time. Morgan felt the room around him dim slightly as the magnitude of the discovery settled in. 66 years of grief, 66 years of unanswered questions, 66 years of a family torn apart, and now, finally, a path toward truth. For the Criminal Schema, this is where our story begins, not with the match itself, but with the long, painful journey that preceded it. A journey spanning generations, jurisdictions, scientific eras, and the haunting persistence of a family that refused to let a young girl's memory disappear into silence. As you watch this story unfold, remember to like, comment, and subscribe to the Criminal Schema, where we continue investigating the cold cases that time tried to forget, ensuring every victim's story is told, and every lost voice has the chance to be heard again. The years that followed Helen Patterson's disappearance settled over the small coal town of Ashford like a quiet, unspoken winter. Life did not stop, because it could not. But everything from the shift whistles to the Sunday church bells seemed muted, as though a thin veil lay between the town and the world it once knew. People still bought their bread at Kowalski's store, children still played in the schoolyard, and the miners still trudged to the buses before sunrise. But beneath the surface, an unease remained, something that lingered in the corners of conversations and in the glances exchanged across front porches. Helen Patterson had become the shadow no one wanted to name aloud, yet everyone carried with them. For Catherine Patterson, time did not blur or soften the pain. Every day was a date measured from the last morning she saw her daughter walk down Cedar Lane. Every passing season was merely a reminder of one more stretch of life Helen never lived. Catherine could never accept that the girl she kissed goodbye that October morning simply stepped out of the world. And so she clung to the belief that answers must exist somewhere buried in a file, a photograph, a witness who had overlooked something, a stranger who might speak up someday. Her husband, Thomas, carried his grief with the hollow endurance of a man who had spent a lifetime underground. The coal mines taught men how to survive in the dark, but not how to survive a darkness born from loss. He said little. He worked his shifts, came home, slept too little, and began to drink more than a man should, but he never criticized Catherine's desperate search for explanations. He knew it came from the same place in her that ached inside him. He knew each of them was surviving in whatever way they could. As the 1960s began, the Patterson case became one of those stories that every family in Ashford carried forward. Children who hadn't even been born in 1958 would eventually hear it whispered by their parents: the girl who vanished walking home from school. The girl who never made it past the corner at Maple Street and Highland Road. Teachers used Helen's story to warn students about walking alone. Pastors worked it into sermons about vigilance and community. It became a cautionary tale wrapped in fear and mourning. But outside the Patterson home, the case was slowly becoming paperwork, the kind that sits in metal cabinets for decades. Detectives moved on. Departments shifted focus. Files were boxed and reboxed, relocated, mislabeled, and in some cases, nearly forgotten. The world changed around the case. New presidents, new wars, new technologies, new generations who would hear Helen's name but never fully grasp the weight it carried for those who lived through the search. When the 1970s arrived, the Patterson home carried the atmosphere of a museum curated by grief. Helen's room remained preserved, to an extent that unsettled visitors. Drawers still held her neatly folded cardigans, her school papers still rested on her desk, her glass figurines still lined the dresser in the order she had arranged them. Catherine had woven these details into her identity. They were the last tangible evidence of her child's existence, and she believed maintaining them was a way to keep Helen anchored in the world. Thomas worried for his wife. Though he was ill-equipped to express such concern, he watched the rituals grow more frequent and more consuming. Her letters to investigators increased. Her visits to the police station grew more desperate. Her theories multiplied. Grief had taken hold of her mind in a way that blurred the line between dedication and obsession. And although townspeople whispered about her behavior, none could deny they would have broken in their own ways if their child had vanished without a trace. On a cold morning in early autumn of 1976, tragedy struck the Patterson family once more. A collapse in shaft number 7 sealed Thomas Patterson's fate in an instant. Catherine received the news numbly, almost quietly, as though she had been waiting for another cruel turn from a world that had shown her little mercy. People rallied around her for a time, but grief had now wrapped itself around her life in a way that few could penetrate. Helen's case was no longer just a loss. It was the axis on which Catherine's remaining years would revolve. The 80s passed in fragments for her. The community saw her less often. She grew quieter, more inward, more elusive. But every October 3rd, she still made the solemn walk to the Ashford police station to file her annual missing person report, whether anyone encouraged it or not. And every year, new officers who did not know her story would watch her leave the station with a mixture of bewilderment and pity, unaware they had just witnessed a mother refusing to surrender to time. Meanwhile, Helen's younger brother, James, grew into adulthood, overshadowed by memories he could barely grasp. His sister lived more vividly in the stories his mother repeated than in the faint images he retained from his own early childhood. He pursued a quiet life accounting, a modest home, a desire for stability after decades of uncertainty. But Helen remained a presence, woven into the fabric of his identity. He had long understood that his mother's world revolved around finding the truth. And when her memory began to erode in her final years, James felt a duty to pick up the threads she could no longer hold. By the time Catherine passed away in the winter of 2021, James faced a house filled with more than 60 years of accumulated notes, letters, maps, clippings, and theories. A lifetime of searching was stored in boxes stacked floor to ceiling, organized by a system that only Catherine understood. Some boxes contained police reports she had copied again and again. Others held correspondence with families from other missing persons cases. Some held little more than newspaper clippings, with handwritten annotations in the margins, dates circled, names underlined, imprecise connections drawn between towns separated by hundreds of miles. To anyone else, the house would have appeared chaotic. But James recognized something more meaningful. His mother had been trying, in her own way, to connect dots that no one else had bothered to examine. And in those boxes, buried under decades of grief and determination, he found documents that suggested his mother had stumbled near truths no one had taken seriously. There were patterns in geography, timelines, and witness accounts that had never been connected because the cases spanned counties that rarely shared information in those days. James began digitizing everything, scanning page after page late into the evenings, determined to preserve what his mother had spent her life compiling. It was during this process that he reached out to retired detective Margaret Sullivan, whose discovery of the misfiled evidence box back in 2003 had quietly reignited the case. Though now retired, Sullivan had never stopped thinking about Helen's disappearance. When James showed her the digitized files, the maps, the patterns Catherine had painstakingly traced, Sullivan realized that the case was no longer dormant, it had been waiting. Together, James and Sullivan approached the Pennsylvania State Police with a request that would change everything. They wanted the fiber samples from Helen's torn dress, retested using modern DNA extraction techniques. It was a long-shot request, one that many departments might have declined due to cost, time, or skepticism. But in this instance, persistence paid off. The request was approved, and Dr. Sarah Chen from the State Crime Lab began a process that would take months, using forensic tools that did not exist when Helen disappeared. Meanwhile, Detective Richard Morgan, a veteran of cold cases for more than 2 decades, was assigned to oversee the renewed investigation. He had spent his career working on long-forgotten files and knew the emotional landscape of these cases intimately, the quiet ache in families who had waited too long for answers, and the humbling realization that truth can remain buried for decades. Morgan approached the Patterson file with caution, but also with a sense of responsibility. He recognized that this was not simply an old case. It represented the culmination of a mother's lifelong search and a family's enduring hope for closure. The laboratory work progressed slowly, but it was deliberate and meticulous. The samples taken from the torn seam of Helen's dress fibers, collected by FBI technician Lawrence Chen in 1958, had survived thanks to his careful handling and the cool, dry conditions of the courthouse storage. When Dr. Chen completed the DNA extraction, the partial profile was unlike anything expected from evidence that old. And although the traditional CODIS database produced no immediate matches, the use of forensic genetic genealogy opened a door that had been closed for decades. Through painstaking comparison with publicly shared ancestry databases, genealogists constructed a complex family tree stretching back generations. Branch by branch, relative by relative, the possibilities narrowed. The network of distant cousins pointed to a handful of individuals, and eventually to one man whose name had barely appeared in the original investigation, William Francis Garrett. When the match was confirmed in early 2024, Morgan felt the ground shift beneath him. But the revelation raised more questions. How had Garrett, a man who had lived within walking distance of Helen's route home, escaped suspicion all those years? Why had no one recognized patterns that would later reveal a trail of violence through multiple counties? And how many victims, like Helen, had vanished without justice simply because jurisdictions never compared notes? Those were questions that demanded answers. So Morgan began the painstaking process of reconstructing Garrett's life, his movements, his employment records, his arrests, his residences. He interviewed surviving relatives, combed through archives, searched through decades of reports that had never been connected, pieced together incidents long forgotten. Slowly, he stitched a narrative that revealed a chilling pattern. For more than 2 decades, Garrett had moved between rural towns, targeting young women and girls who walked alone, leaving behind a trail of fear that had remained scattered and unlinked until forensic science finally pulled the threads together. But the most haunting moment came when ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs were brought to one of Garrett's final properties. Beneath the basement floor, investigators found a metal ammunition box. Inside were small, personal objects that told the silent stories of girls who never made it home. Objects Garrett had kept hidden, preserved in darkness. Among them was a delicate glass bluebird. It had once sat on the dresser of a 13-year-old girl named Helen Patterson. The discovery shattered any remaining doubt. And for James Patterson, it brought the closest thing to closure he would ever receive. It was not the ending anyone wanted, but it was the truth his family had waited more than 6 decades to hear. The courthouse basement in Ashford had always smelled faintly of damp concrete and forgotten years. A place where dust settled like a second skin over everything the county no longer had the energy or resources to remember. It was in that place, beneath humming fluorescent bulbs and the distant echo of clerks walking on the floors above, that Detective Margaret Sullivan first saw the evidence box that would eventually change the course of the Patterson investigation. It was late in the afternoon, and the July heat had pushed the temperature inside the basement into something nearly unbearable. Sullivan wiped perspiration from her forehead as she scanned the shelves, clipboard in hand, checking off rusted metal drawers and water-stained boxes labeled with thick black marker. Most of them contained routine administrative paperwork, old tax records, archived jury lists, outdated zoning maps, but the box at the very end of a warped wooden shelf was different. She almost missed it entirely. Only the faintly smudged case number on its side caught her eye. The numbers pressed unevenly, as if typed by a machine decades older than she was. Inside the box, she found an entire world that should never have been allowed to vanish into dust. The Patterson case file was larger than she expected, heavier too, as though the weight of almost half a century of grief had settled inside it. She lifted the evidence envelopes with careful hands, expecting little more than degraded materials long past their usefulness. But then, she saw the dress. A yellow floral cotton dress, carefully folded beneath brittle sheets of logged paperwork. A small tear cleaved the right side seam, the fibers still separated in a way that suggested force rather than simple wear. And beside it, sealed in aging plastic envelopes, sat the fiber samples collected by FBI technician Lawrence Chen in 1958. Sullivan paused, her fingertips hovering above the envelopes before pulling them toward her. Something in her gut stirred. Her training had taught her to trust that feeling. She carried the box upstairs, away from the stillness of forgotten places, and into the fluorescent-lit world where evidence could breathe again. James Patterson, meanwhile, had been sorting through his mother's belongings in a silence so heavy it felt alive. Catherine Patterson's passing had left a hollow space inside the old house on Cedar Lane, a house whose walls had long been covered with newspaper clippings, hand-drawn maps, and letters she never stopped sending to agencies across several states. The shadows in Helen's room seemed deeper that winter after Catherine's death. Snow piled against the windowsills, and James spent his evenings uncovering file after file of things his mother had archived through decades of searching. He expected to find the familiar theories she had repeated through the years, lists of men she believed investigators overlooked, letters returned unopened from police departments too overwhelmed or too understaffed to respond. But he found much more. His mother had not simply obsessed. She had investigated. Meticulously. Tirelessly. He uncovered letters between Catherine and families in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. Handwritten charts connecting disappearances by date, county, and highway access. Newspaper articles clipped from local papers across 3 states. A map covered in small colored pins that Catherine had placed without anyone understanding how deeply she believed in the pattern they represented. James felt grief rise inside him in a wave so strong it nearly pushed him to his knees. His mother had spent more than 6 decades trying to understand her daughter's fate, left alone to carry a burden no one else had fully believed was reasonable. And yet, here he was, tracing connections she had documented with remarkable clarity. Connections she had insisted mattered. She had been dismissed by many as unstable. But with every file James scanned and digitized, her persistence began to look less like desperation and more like foresight. His call to Detective Sullivan in the spring of 2021 had been brief, almost apologetic. He wasn't sure anyone would take him seriously. But Sullivan had already been thinking about the Patterson file since the moment she rediscovered it in the courthouse basement. When James explained what he had found, thousands of documents, some neatly organized, others scribbled in frantic handwriting, Sullivan understood that something Catherine had left behind might be the missing piece. It was enough for her to ask the Pennsylvania State Police to reopen the file, enough for her to push for DNA testing that had once been considered too costly or too unlikely to yield results, enough to begin again. By the following year, the evidence had been transferred to the State Forensic Laboratory, where newer technology could extract biological material that older systems never could. The dress, after being sealed and forgotten for so many decades, had protected microscopic particles of skin cells lodged within the torn seam. Those particles, barely visible to the human eye, would become the thread that connected all the years and all the unanswered questions. The laboratory technician, Dr. Sarah Chen, approached the fabric fragments with the precision of someone who understood the magnitude of what she might uncover. She worked through long evenings, adjusting equipment and fine-tuning extraction techniques that only recent advancements had made possible. And when the system finally generated a partial but viable DNA profile, Chen stared at the screen, realizing she was holding something that had never existed before. A genetic signature left behind in 1958 by someone who had never been caught. At first, the profile matched no entries in the CODIS database. No surprise, many offenders from that era never had DNA samples taken, and older criminal records were incomplete or inconsistently archived. But forensic genealogy offered a different path. When investigators uploaded the partial profile to a public ancestry database, distant relatives began to appear. Second cousins, third cousins, lines of shared ancestry that eventually converged on a set of families whose roots extended deep into rural Pennsylvania. Through painstaking work, genealogist Dr. Rebecca Foster narrowed the possibilities to two men who would have been in the right age range during the late 1950s. One of them cooperated willingly and provided a DNA sample that excluded him. The other possibility was already dead. William Francis Garrett. The name meant nothing to James Patterson at the time, nothing to Sullivan either. But as Detective Richard Morgan would soon learn, Garrett's life intersected with Helen's in a way investigators from the late 1950s had been unable to see. The property where he lived stood directly along her walking route home from school. He had been questioned once as part of routine canvassing, but only briefly. Records showed nothing unusual about him on paper. A coal miner, familiar in the community in the quiet, unremarkable way that made him invisible. He was never considered a viable suspect. And then he faded from the investigation entirely. Years later, decades later, more than half a century later, that invisibility would collapse. Detective Morgan studied Garrett's background with the single-minded focus of someone who understood he was standing at the edge of a truth that had escaped investigators for longer than most careers lasted. He found fragments of Garrett's life scattered between counties, arrest reports that never led to convictions, witness statements that went nowhere, and police interviews, in which teenage girls described fear that no one could corroborate. The earliest report appeared in 1959, a year after Helen disappeared. A 17-year-old girl attacked in an alley behind her workplace. The attacker had fled. She later moved out of state, and the case closed quietly. But Morgan saw the pattern immediately. Age ranges similar, locations similar, time of day similar. None of the cases connected officially, but unofficially, the pattern formed a trail stretching across western Pennsylvania, disappearing and reappearing like a shadow slipping between towns. Morgan reached out to Andrew Walsh Jr., hoping the son might still have something belonging to the father, Detective Andrew Walsh Sr. The state investigator who had worked Helen's disappearance back in 1958, Walsh Jr. had boxes of his father's old case notes stored in the attic, collecting dust but never thrown away. Among them sat a folder labeled, "Similar Incidents, Unconfirmed." It was not part of any official case file. It was the private record of a detective who could not let go of the feeling that one man had slipped through his fingers. Inside the folder, Morgan found surveillance notes, observations, timelines, nothing that could have secured a conviction back then, but enough to show that Walsh Sr. had strongly suspected Garrett. He wrote that Garrett had habits consistent with predatory behavior and had been seen near the area of Helen's disappearance on multiple afternoons. But without direct evidence, without DNA, without forensic technology capable of extracting the truth hidden in the torn fibers of Helen's dress, Walsh Sr. could do nothing. Garrett had simply continued living his life, untouched by suspicion, unnoticed by most. Garrett died in the year 2020, his offenses mostly unknown beyond scattered records that few ever connected. His name absent from any major criminal database. His death should have sealed his secrets forever. But DNA held memories he could not erase. Memories waiting in a courthouse basement for nearly half a century. Memories that eventually guided investigators to his final property, the one his estranged son allowed them to search. Ground-penetrating radar swept the soil. Cadaver dogs alerted to unfamiliar scents beneath layers of time. And then, they found the metal ammunition box, buried under the basement floor. When investigators opened it, they found a collection of personal items stored with meticulous care. Trophies, though the documentary never needed to use the word directly. There was no need for sensationalism. Truth carried enough weight on its own. Among those objects, contained within soft, decaying cloth, sat a small porcelain bluebird. Painted in gentle shades of sky and cobalt, its wings slightly raised. The same figurine Helen Patterson had displayed on her dresser in 1958. Photographs from the original investigation confirmed it. The match was unmistakable. The room fell silent when Morgan placed the bluebird on the table in front of James Patterson. For James, the object was not merely evidence. It was a piece of his sister he had not known he'd been waiting to find. He reached out slowly, as if touching something sacred. The porcelain felt cool, smooth, unchanged by the decades spent hidden underground. James held it in his hands, and for the first time since he was 4 years old, the memory of his sister felt closer than ever. In April of 2024, the Pennsylvania State Police formally closed Helen's case, naming William Francis Garrett as the man responsible for her disappearance and death. No courtroom would ever hear the evidence. No judge would ever sentence the man responsible. But truth itself carried its own kind of justice, however late it arrived. The investigation now shifted to identifying the owners of the remaining items found in Garrett's possession. Some belonged to missing girls whose cases remained open. Others belonged to victims who had never been identified. Families across several counties reached out when the news broke, each of them wondering if their unanswered questions might finally lead to closure. Helen Patterson's story, once known only to the residents of Ashford and buried in yellowed pages of forgotten reports, now took on a different life. Not only in the evidence laboratory, not only in the courtroom that would never be convened, but in the hearts of those who had carried her memory for 66 years. Her case illuminated gaps in communication between jurisdictions during earlier decades. It demonstrated the life-saving importance of preserving evidence long beyond its era. And it reminded investigators everywhere that forgotten cases were often not forgotten at all, not by the families who waited, nor by the files still waiting quietly on dusty shelves. The discovery of the decaying cardboard evidence box in the courthouse basement marked the quiet return of a case that many believed had long since drifted into the unreachable past. Margaret Sullivan stood alone among rows of forgotten files and dust-covered shelves, the harsh fluorescent basement lights humming above her as she pulled the warped lid from its water-stained container. She had not expected anything significant when she began the inventory project earlier that month. It was the kind of administrative task that officers dreaded, a process of cataloging old civil records, parking citations from decades earlier, and the endless sea of property deeds that had accumulated over generations. But the Patterson box felt different the moment she touched it. Even through her latex gloves, she could feel how the cardboard had softened from years of exposure to damp air and slow decay. A piece of faded masking tape stretched across the top had been marked with the words, "Patterson, 1958, typed unevenly by a manual typewriter. The moment Sullivan read the name, she recalled flashes of the lingering local legend whispered in training seminars and small-town diners. The teenager who vanished one autumn afternoon, and whose story had never found its ending. She lifted the files with care, afraid that the brittle paper might crumble in her hands. The scent of old paper, mildew, and dormant time rose up like a ghost. Within the box lay the remnants of an investigation conducted in a world without DNA testing, without digital databases, without the forensic systems that modern officers regarded as essential. Layer by layer, she uncovered the hand-typed witness statements, the black and white photographs shot with the stiff flash of mid-century film, and the faded evidence bags that contained whatever the investigators of that era could collect by hand. At the bottom, beneath water-stained envelopes and a folded diagram of Maple Street, she saw the dress. It was sealed inside a transparent evidence bag marked as Item 4. The yellow floral fabric, once bright and cheerful when Helen wore it on the morning of her disappearance, had faded into a muted impression of its former self. The tear along its side seam was clear and violent in its implication. Sullivan paused, holding the bag gently as if the fabric might disintegrate if she moved too quickly. The fibers along the torn edge were frayed and irregular in a way that the original investigators had described but had not been able to interpret. Next to the dress lay small envelopes labeled as fiber samples and fabric fragments. each one carefully initialed and dated by FBI technician Lawrence Chen. Sullivan recognized his name from other cases, always associated with precision, patience, and a forward-thinking approach uncommon in the late 1950s. Even then, he had collected samples in the hope that future science might one day be able to do what his tools could not. Sullivan carried the box upstairs, her heartbeat steady but quickened by an unmistakable sense of purpose. She spent the rest of the afternoon photographing each item, documenting its condition, and resealing everything according to contemporary chain of custody standards. Although decades had passed, she treated every scrap of fabric and every page as though they had been handed to her that very morning. She knew the case was too old to pursue actively without new evidence, but she also understood that the moment she reintroduced the Patterson file into circulation, the story would begin its slow momentum toward a future no one had predicted. The files passed quietly into the state archives, where they remained dormant for several more years. Sullivan never stopped thinking about them, even after she retired. She carried a lingering sense of unfinished responsibility, an intuition that the evidence had continued relevance waiting to be discovered. The story of Helen Patterson had a way of lingering in people's minds long after they learned it, and Sullivan was no exception. When Catherine Patterson died in December of 2021 and her son James began sorting through the mountain of documents in his mother's home, another thread of the case began to pull itself loose from time's grip. The sight of Helen's bedroom, transformed into a place of obsessive preservation, left James shaken. The maps, the photographs, the letters, and the handwritten timelines covered every available surface, a testament to the decades Catherine had spent chasing fragments of information that no one else believed connected. Her handwriting, once neat and orderly, became increasingly erratic in later years, stretching across pages with desperate intensity. James spent days carefully gathering her papers, scanning them into organized digital folders, cataloging them with the same methodical precision that had defined his career. He expected the process to be painful and emotionally draining, but what he didn't expect was the pattern that slowly emerged from the chaos. He started to notice that his mother's theories, those that neighbors and even law enforcement had long dismissed, contained more structure than madness. Yes, she had chased psychics, corresponded with questionable private investigators, and woven together abductors that never existed. But hidden among those ramblings were letters from other families, cases from neighboring states, and timelines she had constructed that aligned disappearances across counties that had never communicated with one another. Her maps, filled with pins and string, revealed clusters that had never been analyzed by law enforcement because the disappearances belonged to jurisdictions that rarely collaborated. James found himself returning repeatedly to the digitized scans, marking patterns, building charts, and cross-referencing dates. He did not want to become consumed as his mother had been, but he felt obligated to understand the work she had devoted her life to. In doing so, he began to realize that Helen's case had never been a solitary tragedy. It existed in proximity to a series of disappearances and assaults that spanned decades and counties, all along rural roads and small towns, connected by the same highway networks. He knew he needed help, and that help came from the one person who had found the original evidence box nearly 20 years earlier. When he called Margaret Sullivan, now retired but still working occasionally as a consultant, she remembered the Patterson file instantly. She remembered the dress, the fragile fabric, and the fiber samples collected by Lawrence Chen. She remembered the feeling she had in the courthouse basement, the unspoken sense that those materials had been waiting for something. When James told her about his mother's papers and asked whether the evidence from the box had ever been tested with modern DNA techniques, Sullivan felt that old pulse of purpose return. DNA extraction methods had improved significantly since the early 2000s. Laboratories were now capable of isolating genetic material from fragments so small they would have been useless just a decade earlier. The discovery of Helen's preserved dress and fiber samples represented a rare opportunity, and Sullivan knew who could help push the case forward: the Pennsylvania State Police Cold Case Division. She contacted a former colleague who forwarded the file to Detective Richard Morgan. Morgan had seen dozens of cold cases in his 20-plus years, investigating the most forgotten files. Some were unsolvable, some lacked evidence, and some rested on the thin edge of unanswered questions that would forever remain out of reach. But when he opened the Patterson file, he sensed immediately that the original investigators had laid down a foundation stronger than they ever realized. Their limitations had been technological, not procedural. They had gathered everything they could, meticulously cataloged every scrap, and preserved evidence that would one day become viable under technologies they could not have imagined. Morgan submitted the dress and fiber samples to the Pennsylvania State Crime Laboratory, where Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic analyst known for her precision and innovation, accepted the challenge. She used advanced techniques, developed only in recent years, to extract biological material from the microscopic fibers collected in 1958. The process was slow, methodical, and delicate. There were moments when she feared the degradation was too severe, that time had finally erased whatever clues those fibers once held. But after weeks of careful handling, she obtained a partial DNA profile, fragile, incomplete, but usable. Morgan knew a partial profile would not match anything inside CODIS unless the perpetrator had a record that produced a very close match. When the CODIS search returned no immediate result, he expected the case to stall once again. But this time the evidence would go further. The breakthrough came from the emerging field of forensic genetic genealogy, a method capable of linking crime scene DNA to distant relatives through public genetic databases. It was a process that required patience and the expertise of trained genealogists, but it had already solved several high-profile cold cases across the country. Dr. Rebecca Foster, a respected genetic genealogist, took on the Patterson case. She worked backward from distant DNA matches found in public genealogy sites, constructing family trees that branched across centuries. She folded census records, birth certificates, marriage documents, and burial archives into massive genealogical maps. Slowly, after 8 weeks of meticulous research, the branches converged on a single family line. That line included 2 men whose age and location in 1958 made them possible suspects. One man was still living, and he agreed to provide a DNA sample that quickly cleared him. The other man, William Francis Garrett, had died 4 years earlier. His DNA had been collected in a routine arrest shortly before his death, and his genetic profile had been uploaded to the state database only because Pennsylvania expanded its posthumous DNA retention policies. The match was irrefutable. Morgan felt both satisfaction and dread in equal measure. A match this strong confirmed that someone had left biological material on Helen's dress the day she disappeared, but the man responsible was long dead, shielded forever from the consequences of his actions. Morgan knew this would be only the beginning. He needed to understand who William Garrett was, where he had lived, and what else he might have done. As he dug into the background of the man whose DNA matched the evidence collected from a torn dress nearly 7 decades earlier, he realized something chilling. Garrett had lived along the exact path Helen walked to school. Not only that, but he had been questioned once in the early weeks of the investigation, and then dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Morgan began to unravel the threads of Garrett's life, tracing his employment history, his residences, and his criminal record. What he found painted the portrait of a man who had moved through rural Pennsylvania with an unsettling consistency, leaving behind scattered records of intimidation, stalking, and assaults that were never properly connected. When Morgan contacted the son of the late William Garrett, he found a man burdened with years of fear and estrangement. Michael Garrett had long sensed his father was dangerous, even if he never imagined the magnitude of his crimes. When Morgan explained the DNA evidence and the likelihood that his father was responsible for Helen Patterson's disappearance, Michael agreed immediately to grant access to his father's former properties. The search of those properties would lead to discoveries that would shake the foundation of the Patterson case and illuminate a pattern of predatory violence stretching across decades. It was a story still unfolding in the spring of 2024, and Morgan knew that with every step forward, the final truth about Helen Patterson crept closer to the surface. The winter after Catherine Patterson's decline marked a quiet transformation in the life of her son, James. Grief had settled into the corners of his home like dust he could not quite sweep away. But something else had emerged too, a sharpening of purpose, a clarity that had eluded him during the long years he had spent trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, while his mother's mind slowly unraveled around the absence of Helen. For decades, he had stood beside Catherine's obsessive devotion without fully understanding the mechanism that drove her. The belief that somewhere in the mountains, in the towns scattered across western Pennsylvania. There existed an answer that would someday illuminate the darkness she had been living in since that October afternoon in 1958. Now, in the months after her death, James felt the unmistakable weight of inheritance, not of objects or money, but of duty, an unspoken promise that he now understood had been passed to him long before his mother ever knew she would need someone to continue searching when she no longer could. Each evening, after finishing dinner at the kitchen table he had grown up around, James walked downstairs to the small basement room where he had stored the boxes he recovered from his mother's house. They were stacked in uneven towers, some labeled in Catherine's increasingly shaky handwriting, others left completely unmarked as her organizational system began collapsing in the final years of her illness. He worked through them methodically. It was the only way he knew how to approach a task that felt as enormous as the mountain ridges that stretched across Helen's childhood landscape. He scanned every photograph, every letter, every scrap of paper containing Catherine's scrawled timelines. Some pages were nearly illegible, written during periods when her mind had begun slipping into fractured memories and imagined connections. But James refused to discard anything. Disorder had never frightened him. Uncertainty had. The possibility that some small detail, some overlooked reference or forgotten report might change the direction of Helen's case kept him pulling long nights in that basement, long after most of the neighborhood had gone quiet. He grew used to the glow of the scanner lighting the room, the soft hum of his aging computer, the sound of paper sliding across the desk as he preserved decades of his mother's labor. He began noticing patterns in her work, not just the erratic leaps between theories, but the threads she returned to again and again. Certain towns appeared repeatedly on her maps, circles drawn at slightly different angles each time, pins stuck in places she believed were connected not by geography, but by behavior. Catherine had never possessed the tools to analyze those patterns with precision, but her instincts, sharpened by grief, had pointed her toward truths she could never fully articulate. It was deep into this process, months after the funeral, when the numbness began hardening into focus, that James recognized the need for professional support. He reached out to Detective Margaret Sullivan, whose name he had encountered repeatedly in the later case updates stored inside his mother's files. His voice trembled slightly when he first explained why he was calling, not out of fear but from the weight of trying to bridge nearly 7 decades of unanswered questions. Sullivan listened with the steady patience of someone who had lived long enough in the world of unsolved disappearances to understand that time did not weaken the hold of such mysteries. In some cases, it only deepened it. She remembered the Patterson case. She remembered the basement box, and the surprising preservation of evidence that had survived decades of bureaucratic neglect. She remembered the fabric fragments, the yellow floral dress, the fibers collected by FBI technician Lawrence Chen, with a level of care that would prove prophetic. By the time James finished explaining his efforts, the digitization of his mother's archives, the patterns he believed he was beginning to see, Sullivan did not need convincing. She had waited years for someone with the determination to reopen the door that had been left ajar by outdated tools and impossible limitations. She agreed to meet with him, not as a courtesy, but because she felt the unmistakable hum of possibility, something she had felt only a handful of times in her career. Their first meeting took place in a modest conference room in the county office building, where sunlight filtered through blinds that rattled softly in the vented air. James set a portable hard drive on the table, containing the thousands of scanned documents he had spent nearly half a year organizing. Sullivan recognized many of the images. The black and white photographs of the search parties, the evidence bags stamped with dates written in 1958 typewriter ink, the witness statements she had once reviewed in her early years on the job. But she saw something else too, an evolution. James had taken chaos and carved order from it, something that neither Catherine nor her overwhelmed mind had ever been able to achieve. Sullivan found herself tracing the outlines of his charts with her finger, following his digital paths through the towns that had haunted Catherine's maps. She began to see connections she had overlooked years earlier. Threads that stretched farther than the boundaries of any single jurisdiction. That afternoon marked the beginning of a partnership neither of them had anticipated. Together, they re-examined the evidence with the benefit of both technological advancement and emotional clarity. Sullivan contacted former colleagues, forensic analysts, and technicians who had witnessed the astonishing leaps in DNA extraction methods over the past decade. She petitioned the Pennsylvania State Police to authorize a full review of the physical evidence connected to Helen Patterson's disappearance. At first, the request was met with bureaucratic hesitancy. Cold case initiatives were costly, requiring significant resources for uncertain outcomes. But Sullivan persisted, armed not only with James's digitized work but with the undeniable truth that forensic technology had reached a point where even the faintest biological material, minute skin cells, trapped in fabric threads, could hold the power to resurrect forgotten evidence. By the end of that year, the Pennsylvania State Crime Laboratory agreed to begin a full reanalysis of the fiber samples and fabric fragments once collected by technician Lawrence Chen. The evidence, sealed in aged containers but miraculously preserved, was transferred to Harrisburg, where technicians began the painstaking process of extraction under conditions that would have been unimaginable in the mid-20th century. The waiting was excruciating. Weeks turned into months as the lab attempted to isolate usable DNA from fiber strands no wider than a human hair. James found himself living in a state of suspended animation, checking his email multiple times a day, flinching each time the phone rang unexpectedly. Sullivan, experienced in the rhythm of forensic timelines, tried to temper his expectations, but she too felt the tension of those long winter days. It was during this period of waiting that Detective Richard Morgan entered the case. A veteran investigator with more than 2 decades devoted to cold cases, Morgan possessed the rare blend of analytical precision and instinctive empathy that made him uniquely capable of navigating the emotional landscape of long-buried tragedies. When the first preliminary lab report reached his desk, he recognized immediately that this was not just another cold case file dusted off for review. This was something different, something historic. The initial findings were promising. Technicians had recovered a partial DNA profile from the fibers embedded in the torn seam of Helen's dress. It was not complete, but it was viable. The profile was uploaded to the combined DNA index system, but no direct match appeared. This was not surprising. Morgan had worked enough cold cases to know that many perpetrators operated in eras when DNA databases did not exist, and many had died long before the establishment of modern forensic collection laws. But forensic genealogy had changed everything. Morgan authorized the next step, one that would extend the investigation beyond criminal databases into the realm of ancestry tracking, where distant relatives, third, fourth, or even fifth cousins might hold the key to identifying the source of the DNA found on Helen's dress. The process required time. Genetic genealogist Dr. Rebecca Foster worked through countless branches of family trees, tracing connections through public records, obituaries, census documents, and archival birth certificates. It was painstaking work, the kind that demanded equal parts patience, intuition, and technical skill. Week by week, she narrowed the possibilities. When she finally called Morgan with the first breakthrough, her voice carried the unmistakable tremor of revelation. The DNA pointed toward a specific ancestral line, one rooted deeply in western Pennsylvania, connected to families who had lived within miles of Helen Patterson's walking route at the time of her disappearance. From that tree, 2 names emerged. 2 men whose ages, geographical locations, and familial ties fit the timeline. Morgan reached one of them, an elderly man living quietly in the northern part of the state. He agreed to provide a DNA sample, confident he had nothing to hide. The test results returned a week later, clearing him entirely. That left one name: William Francis Garrett, a man who had lived his entire life within the very region where Helen disappeared. A man whose record contained faint traces of violence only visible when examined across multiple counties. A man who had died 4 years earlier, his DNA preserved unknowingly during a routine arrest for aggravated assault late in his life. Morgan felt a chill as he stared at the file. The past had just opened its eyes. He ordered a full historical background search on Garrett, requesting every available document from every county Garrett had lived in. At first glance, nothing about him stood out yet. Morgan's experience told him that monsters often managed to live inside the cracks of small towns, protected by the familiarity of community and the shortcomings of pre-digital record-keeping. The deeper Morgan dug, the darker the picture became. Garrett had been questioned only once, in connection with Helen Patterson's disappearance, briefly, almost casually. The way officers in the 1950s often interviewed residents during large-scale canvasses. His name appeared only in a single line of the original investigation file, swallowed by thousands of pages that chronicled the frantic search effort. But Morgan saw it differently. To him, that single line was the footprint of a ghost, a presence faint enough to escape attention, but undeniable once illuminated. He pulled Garrett's employment records. He cross-referenced his addresses with known disappearance sites from the late 1950s onward. He searched police reports for patterns: stalking incidents, assaults on teenage girls, unexplained attacks on women walking alone. Separately, these incidents had been treated as isolated. Connected, they revealed a chilling continuity. And then, Morgan found something unexpected. A name that appeared not just in his digital search, but in a box of old files stored in the attic of a retired detective. Andrew Walsh, Jr., son of the original state detective assigned to Helen's case, still possessed his father's personal notes. These notes were never part of the official file. They detailed suspicions Walsh Sr. had harbored for years, suspicions about William Garrett. Walsh Sr. had followed him, studied him, believed he was dangerous, but he never acquired the evidence needed to build a case. Between those attic files and the digital genealogy chart, the pattern was finally undeniable. The realization struck Morgan with a force he had not felt in years. The answer had always been there, hiding in the margins of old reports, waiting for a world with the technology and the tenacity to see it. And now, with a DNA match, many decades after Helen Patterson vanished on a cool October afternoon, the truth had finally begun to surface. In the weeks that followed, the discovery beneath William Garrett's final home, the investigation that had once felt like a fading ghost story, began to take on a clarity that astonished everyone involved. Detectives and forensic specialists who joined the case late found themselves quietly admitting that they had underestimated just how much truth could be hiding inside evidence older than the careers of nearly everyone working on it. And yet, with every new breakthrough, with every box opened and every item cataloged under the cold fluorescence of modern laboratories, the reality of Helen Patterson's final hours came closer, not through speculation, but through evidence, through science, through the quiet stubbornness of a case that refused to die. James Patterson, now in his early 70s, found the sudden acceleration dizzying. For most of his life, the Patterson case had been a shadow that lived just outside the margins of normal conversation, a topic that reshaped rooms when mentioned, a wound that healed wrong and remained tender no matter how many years had passed. Now he watched as his sister's name moved rapidly across digital screens, crime lab databases, state police briefings, and private calls between agencies that had never once spoken to one another back in the late 1950s. Justice, deferred for more than 6 decades, was finally being spoken aloud as a possibility, not a fantasy. The Pennsylvania State Police assigned additional personnel to assist Detective Richard Morgan as the investigation widened. Analysts combed through aging documents from 4 counties, scanning brittle pages into archived databases. Some of these files had sat untouched for half a century in metal cabinets that groaned when opened. Others had been microfilmed during the 1970s and forgotten in basement drawers. Over time, thousands of handwritten reports were digitized, and connections that had once seemed impossible began revealing themselves through simple proximity dates lining up, locations repeating, descriptions overlapping. The surprising part was how close earlier investigators had come without realizing it. Case files from Somerset County referenced a tall young man with a narrow face and a noticeable neck scar. Reports from Westmoreland County described a similar man driving a rust-colored truck near the scene of an attempted abduction. Fayette County files from the early 1960s mentioned a suspect whose demeanor matched Garrett's almost exactly. The patterns were undeniable, and yet, at the time, they had been buried under the limitations of a world without shared databases or coordinated communication between rural departments. Morgan's team began cross-referencing the personal items found inside the ammunition box to every missing person case from the 1950s through the 1980s. The process was slow, painful, and at times emotionally overwhelming. Photographs of young women long gone stared back from yellowing posters scanned into high resolution. Family members, some elderly, some no longer living, had written heartfelt pleas on the backs of those posters, begging for answers they never received. Now those pleas resurfaced in a sterile room, where investigators worked with gloved hands and steady hearts. Among the items, The glass bluebird remained the most defining artifact, a fragile surviving witness to an abduction that had altered the Patterson family forever. For criminal analysts, the figurine represented a rare piece of personal history that couldn't be explained away or misinterpreted. Garrett could not have obtained it unless Helen herself had been with him. And that simple fact cut through 60-plus years of doubt in a way no witness statement ever could. Yet as much as James needed the confirmation, the truth brought a new layer of grief, one he hadn't expected. Knowing what happened to Helen did not erase the 6 decades where he watched his mother wither under the weight of uncertainty. It did not erase the nights when silence filled their home in Ashford like thick smoke, or the mornings when he walked past Helen's bedroom and saw Catherine smoothing the pillow as if Helen might return to use it again. He now knew the truth, but the cost of reaching this truth echoed loudly in every memory still tethered to the old house. Morgan understood this complexity more than most. He had worked cold cases for decades, and he had learned that closure was never as simple as a detective handing over an answer. Cold case closure was a negotiation between the past and the present, between evidence and emotion, between the living and the dead. The Patterson case embodied this like few others. As the investigation into Garrett's properties continued, cadaver dogs alerted to several areas around the perimeter of the Fayette County house. Excavation teams moved slowly, carefully, with the caution of archaeologists working through layers of a fragile dig site. Shovels scraped against soil that had not been touched since the 1980s, and every discovery, whether bone, fragment, metal, or fabric, was treated with solemn reverence. In one section near the back of the house, beneath a patch of soil compacted by decades of neglect, searchers discovered a shallow burial that contained 2 items, a broken silver chain and a pair of rusted metal barrettes. Though no remains were found there, forensic examiners recognized the chain pattern as matching the style of jewelry sold during the early 1960s. The barrettes, though simple, were adorned with tiny flower etchings a young girl might have chosen. More potential victims, more unanswered questions, more pain that had gone unnoticed in the years when rural communities had no coordinated system to detect patterns of predation. As the evidence mounted, the Pennsylvania State Police prepared an internal report summarizing what they believed to be the likely full span of Garrett's crimes. Though the exact number could never be known, analysts concluded that Garrett may have been active for at least 25 years. They estimated that he could have stalked or attacked dozens of girls throughout western Pennsylvania, especially in isolated mining towns and rural communities, where residents often handled their own problems quietly, privately, away from the public eye. At night, Morgan often found himself staring at the original 1958 case photographs. Helen's school portrait sat beside images of the torn yellow dress, the fabric samples, and the sidewalk where her books had been found fluttering in a soft October wind more than 60 years before. Each photograph seemed to whisper a story that had taken modern science to hear clearly. It humbled him. It reminded him why he had joined the cold case division in the first place. Back in State College, James struggled to process the growing flood of information. Each time the phone rang, he braced himself. Each message from Morgan carried new revelations, new threads, connecting his sister's tragedy to a wider map of violence. And though James was grateful for the truth, he couldn't avoid the ache of knowing his parents never had the chance to see these breakthroughs themselves. Their lives had been carved by uncertainty, shaped by grief so constant it had become a daily ritual. Now he held answers they had waited for but never received. He spent long evenings sorting through the digitized archives of Catherine's work, the letters, the maps, the timelines she had drawn. With shaking hands late at night, he saw, with painful clarity, how close she had come to naming the pattern that eluded trained investigators. She saw the connections. She recognized the nature of the threat. She sensed the truth even without the science needed to prove it. Her mind had weakened with obsession, but her instincts had been sharper than anyone gave her credit for. James began writing a statement he hoped to deliver one day when the case officially closed. He wanted to articulate the strange mixture of vindication and sorrow swirling in his chest, how his mother's life, though swallowed by grief, had contained a form of intuition that deserved respect. He wanted to honor his father's steady presence, his quiet suffering, his silent disappointment in a world that failed his daughter. And he wanted to honor Helen, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as the girl she was on the final morning of her life, bright, cheerful, hopeful, carrying school books wrapped in waxed twine and wearing the yellow dress her mother had sewn. Meanwhile, the media began circling the story. Reporters from Pittsburgh and Harrisburg contacted the state police, seeking official statements, but Morgan declined every request. He refused to let sensationalism distort a case that had consumed more than 6 decades of a family's grief. The Criminal Schema. The channel, now preparing to tell Helen's story, maintained discretion, waiting for the final official announcements before crafting their long-form documentary. Respect mattered. Accuracy mattered. No story, no matter how compelling, was worth jeopardizing the integrity of a case still actively unfolding. As April approached, anticipation grew. Morgan's team prepared the final documentation to formally declare Helen Patterson's case solved. In doing so, they assembled not just a summary of Garrett's guilt, but a comprehensive historical record that preserved the work of every investigator who had touched the case, from Chief Brennan and FBI agent Crawford in the late 1950s to Detective Walsh in the 60s, Detective Sullivan in the early 2000s, and finally Morgan's own team in the 2024 concluding years. The Patterson case had become a tapestry woven by generations, a collaboration neither planned nor intentional, but essential. And on the horizon loomed the moment that James had waited almost his entire life to witness, the truth finally rising from beneath the rubble of forgotten evidence, emerging whole, undeniable, and ready to be spoken aloud. For more than 6 decades, the disappearance of 13-year-old Helen Marie Patterson hovered over the small coal town landscape of western Pennsylvania like a ghost that refused to fade. What began as an ordinary autumn day in early October of the late 1950s became the moment that shattered a family, reshaped a community, and lingered through generations of unanswered questions. Helen's walk from school along her familiar route was a routine she had followed hundreds of times, but when she failed to return home that afternoon, the first subtle ripples of worry grew into an overwhelming wave of fear. Her books were found scattered at the corner of Maple Street and Highland Road, their pages fluttering in the cold breeze, her lunch untouched. It was the first physical sign that something had gone terribly wrong. The initial investigation mobilized nearly the entire town. Volunteers combed woods, mine entrances, and creeks. The search expanded to multiple counties. The state police, the FBI, bloodhounds, and detectives from different jurisdictions collaborated with urgency, yet no trace of Helen emerged. Then, winter arrived, and with it, the painful transition from active search to cold case. For Helen's mother, Catherine, the disappearance became a lifelong mission. She preserved Helen's room exactly as it had been the morning she left, and each year on the anniversary of the disappearance, she walked to the police station to file a new report. Her grief deepened into obsession, and the community, once united in compassion, gradually withdrew in quiet discomfort as her desperation grew more visible. Helen's father, Thomas, bore his grief silently, worn down year after year until a mining accident claimed his life nearly 2 decades after Helen vanished. The case might have remained an unsolved tragedy, lost to time were it not for a discovery in the early 2000s by Detective Margaret Sullivan. A forgotten evidence box, misfiled for decades in a courthouse basement, resurfaced. Inside was Helen's torn yellow dress and microscopic fibers, collected in 1958 by an FBI technician whose meticulous methods preserved what the technology of that era could not yet read. Sullivan recognized the significance. Evidence that once seemed meaningless now held forensic potential. Years later, advances in DNA recovery allowed a partial genetic profile to be extracted from those fibers. That profile, run through modern forensic genealogy databases, led investigators to the family tree of a man named William Francis Garrett. Additional research confirmed a disturbing pattern. Garrett had lived near Helen's route, had been briefly questioned in the original investigation, and had a decades-long history of violence toward young girls across several rural counties. Though Garrett had died in the year 2020, ground-penetrating searches at his final residence uncovered a buried metal box containing personal items from multiple victims. Among them was Helen's small porcelain bluebird, a cherished figurine that had once sat on her bedroom dresser. That single object provided the emotional and evidentiary confirmation that had eluded the Patterson family for so long. The Pennsylvania State Police formally closed Helen's case in the spring of 2024, declaring that if Garrett had been alive, he would have faced charges for her abduction and murder. For James Patterson, Helen's younger brother, who had been only 4 years old at the time of her disappearance, the resolution carried both relief and sorrow. His mother had died before the truth emerged, never knowing that her tireless quest had been justified. In the months that followed, Helen's case became a symbol of what persistence, proper evidence, preservation, and technological innovation could achieve. A memorial was placed at the intersection where her books had been found, honoring not only a lost girl but also the community that had searched for her and the investigators who never completely let the case go. Cold case units across the country began re-evaluating long-forgotten evidence, inspired by the possibility that answers still reside in microscopic traces, waiting for science to advance far enough to find them. Helen's story, painful, haunting, and ultimately illuminating, became a reminder that even when justice arrives late, it still matters. It matters to the families who wait, the communities that remember, and the investigators who refuse to surrender to time. And through the work of the Helen Patterson Memorial Fund, her legacy continued, pushing for better evidence preservation laws, interagency cooperation, and support for families living in the painful purgatory of the unknown. This case, once thought impossible to solve, became a testament to what can emerge when determination meets evolving science. It ensured that Helen Marie Patterson, whose life was cut short before it truly began, would no longer be defined by her disappearance, but by the truth that finally returned to her name after 66 years of searching. The years that followed moved quietly, as though time itself understood that the closing of Helen Patterson's case required a gentler pace, a soft lowering of the curtain after more than 6 decades of unanswered questions. The people of Ashford continued with their lives, but something in the atmosphere of the town had shifted, as if the resolution of Helen's disappearance had finally allowed the community to exhale after holding its breath for far too long. For older residents, the truth carried both relief and sorrow. For younger generations, it served as a reminder that even the smallest towns carry histories deeper than they appear, and that unanswered stories do not fade simply because time chooses to move forward. Detective Richard Morgan's retirement came quietly in the late autumn of the year 2026. The Patterson case remained the defining achievement of his career, a case he had entered as a seasoned investigator and left as a man forever changed by the persistence of a family he had never known until the final stretch of their grief. Morgan often reflected on the oddness of solving a murder where justice could no longer be served in court, yet he understood that justice, in the end, had many forms. For the Patterson family, justice had been truth. For the community, justice had been acknowledgement. For Helen, justice had been remembrance. James Patterson spent the next years continuing the work that had grown from his sister's story, using the Helen Patterson Memorial Fund to help families facing the same agonizing limbo his mother had endured. He refused to let Helen's life be defined solely by the moment it was stolen. Instead, he ensured her legacy shaped protections for future victims, improvements in evidence preservation, and widespread awareness of interjurisdictional communication failures that had allowed a predator like William Garrett to evade detection for decades. In speaking at conferences, meeting with families, and working quietly behind the scenes with legislators, James found purpose where grief had once lived, unchallenged. The memorial at Maple Street and Highland Road became a place of quiet reflection. Throughout the seasons, fresh flowers continued to appear, sometimes from people deeply connected to Helen's story, sometimes from strangers who simply felt compelled to leave a gesture of sympathy. At sunrise on quiet mornings, dew settled on the brass plaque like a thin veil of silver, catching the first warm light and making the engraved letters glow. Even when no one stood near the stone, the place felt lived in, cared for, held by the hands of a community that had reclaimed a piece of its past. Every October 3rd, the anniversary of Helen's disappearance, small groups gathered around the memorial to speak her name, share memories, or simply stand in silence. Those who had been part of the original search, now elderly, their voices soft and measured, often told stories about the frantic hours that followed Helen's failure to come home. They spoke of Catherine's desperate calls into the twilight, of the coal miners searching the woods in the dark, of the town gathering with lanterns and flashlights while the leaves crunched beneath their feet. The pain had not vanished, but it had settled into something gentler, something touched by understanding rather than fear. Helen's case reached far beyond Ashford. Universities used the investigation as a model for teaching forensic science and cold case methodology. Forensic genealogists cited it as a landmark demonstration of how patience, preserved evidence, and new technology could meet across generations to reveal truths hidden for decades. Crime analysts studying offender mobility referenced the case to illustrate how predators exploit gaps between jurisdictions. And across the internet, true crime communities revisited Helen's story to understand how an entire era's investigative limitations had shaped the lives of countless families. Yet beyond the research and public discussion, there was a quiet, enduring truth. A 13-year-old girl had lived, loved school, cherished a small bluebird figurine, and dreamed of becoming a teacher. She had been more than a name in an old case file, more than a face on a missing persons poster, more than the victim of a long-buried crime. Her life mattered not only because of the tragedy that befell her, but because of the love she carried, the community that searched for her, and the family that refused to let her be forgotten. As the final chapter of Helen's story settled into place, the criminal schema acknowledged what so many had come to understand through this journey. The resolution of a cold case is not about reopening old wounds. It is about giving voice to those whose stories were left unfinished. It is about ensuring that no victim, no matter how many years have passed, fades into silence. It is about reaffirming that time does not diminish the value of a life, nor weaken the responsibility we share to seek truth. And so, as the documentary concludes, the truth stands unshaken. Helen Patterson waited more than 6 decades for her story to be heard. Through science, persistence, and the refusal of a family to surrender hope, her voice finally returned. Not in the way anyone wished, but in the way she deserved, with clarity, dignity, and a legacy that will continue protecting others long after this story has ended. If you have followed this journey with the criminal schema, remember to like this video, leave a comment to support the work, and subscribe to the channel for more investigations, where the past is never truly silent, and where every unanswered question deserves the chance to be heard.